If you've ever tried to paint a backlit portrait, a candlelit face, or any kind of glowing figure in an oil painting like this example that I painted, and you ended up with something that looks chalky and flat instead of luminous and alive, then you need to learn these secrets of painting light that most oil painters get completely wrong. And here's the thing, it's not about simply painting orange and then gradating it to white. That's actually the fastest way to make your light look like chalk dust. But by the end of this video, you're gonna understand exactly how light behaves when it comes to oil painting and make it actually look like it's glowing authentically. And also why painting portraits bathed in light is actually one of the trickiest compositions you can attempt and what to do about it. Today's video is going to get into the nitty-gritty of color without this being a dull color theory lecture. But because color is such a big topic, to help you all out, I've put together a free guide on how to master color for your oil paintings, complete with every different exercise that you will need in order to really mix color and capture light confidently in your own studio, in your own Alla Prima oil paintings. Plus, I'm going to put some bonus exercises that didn't make it into today's video into that PDF. So the link is down in the description. Go ahead and grab your copy now so you can follow along and then have this as a reference after you watch this video. All right, let's dive into the first secret of painting convincing light. And this is where most people go wrong right from the start. When you see light hitting a face, your instinct is probably to think, okay, if I want to make it look really beautifully lit, I need to control my values. And this is true, but it's also exactly the trap. You think, I just need to add some white to make it lighter. And here's where we get into trouble, because real light doesn't just get lighter, it shifts through the color spectrum as the value changes. Let me explain by saying, instead of the light going from, say, cadmium red to cadmium red plus white to make it look glowing like the flame at the end of a candle, well, going from cad red to cad red plus white gives you a chalky pink mess. What light actually does instead is that it moves through hue shifts. So it goes from cadmium red to cadmium orange to cadmium yellow to cad lemon. And then finally, with your cad lemon, you can start to introduce that white until maybe you get to a pure titanium white. This is why these luminous glowing portraits feel so alive. The artist isn't just painting light, they're painting the journey that light takes through the color spectrum. Now, I know what you're thinking, but that seems like it would be way too warm and orange. And you'd be right to think that, because this is where color temperature becomes crucial. The key is that these warm light notes need to be balanced with cooler shadow shapes and reflected light to create that sense of believable illumination. This brings me to the second secret, and this is where things get tricky. When you're painting a portrait that is bathed in light, there's a good chance that part of the portrait is going to be in shadow. And this creates what I'm going to call the shadow problem. See, when part of the face is in brilliant light and part of the face is in deep shadow, the light and the shadow pattern is probably helping you to describe that person's features. In normal portrait lighting, this is exactly what happens. You can actually rely on the value changes between light and shadow to show the planes of the face, the turn of the nose, the curve of the cheek. But in dramatic lighting situations, a lot of that information gets completely flattened. In the case of this painting that you're watching me paint here, in this case, we have really subtle illumination on the face, but her face is essentially in shadow. We are looking at essentially a backlit portrait. And through my years of teaching oil painters how to paint portraits, I have learned that this is one of the most confounding lighting setups for a portrait that you can possibly embark on. It's not to say that you can't do it and make it look beautiful, but it's one of those traps where it's really easy to go from a really confident portrait painter to wondering if maybe you just got lucky all those previous times and you just don't have the chops that you maybe once thought. And that isn't actually the case. I think what happens is that we wildly underestimate the difference between painting a portrait when the light and shadow pattern is helping us versus just how annoyingly, frustratingly difficult it is to capture a face when we don't have those things working to our advantage. This is why I don't usually recommend this type of composition if you're still getting your bearings when it comes to portraits, or you're in the process of developing your own style still. It's like trying to paint with one hand tied behind your back. That being said, it's not to say that you can't do this and do it beautifully. So if you're dead set on diving into this sort of composition because you realize this is the kind of lighting or composition that really resonates with you and that you want to be able to master and bring into your own paintings, well, I get it, because the results can be absolutely stunning. All you need is to have a really solid foundation in color mixing and value control first. So I'm going to dive in to these color exercises to help give you that color mixing control here in just a moment. But before I do, I want to talk about a couple of additional secrets to painting that glowing light that I think often get overlooked. The first is that when it comes to painting human faces, there are certain parts of the face that tend to really show that glow very strongly. And this is through an effect called subsurface scattering. Essentially, what we're describing is what you see in this portrait that's unfolding. And specifically, you see it in the subject's fingers. If you look really closely at the tips of her fingers, you'll notice that my colors go to a very intense orange or peach or even like a magenta in places. And that is because areas like the fingers or our ears or the little philtrum of our nose tend to be areas where our skin is relatively thin and is thin enough that the light can actually enter our bodies and then bounce around in that body part before escaping back out. Now, I'm not a physicist. I'm sure there's a much better explanation for this phenomenon that sounds way more technical and impressive. But this is why we get that effect in certain lighting conditions where you will notice that parts of someone's nose, ears, fingers, or possibly other body parts as well, where the skin tends to be thinner or that body part just happens to be kind of fine and delicate. It doesn't have a lot of bone sitting underneath, for instance. You will notice in those body parts that if light is illuminating them really strongly, they will tend to show up as almost like a pure cadmium red, cadmium orange, or maybe like a pop of magenta. Oftentimes I notice that painters will recognize these areas and they will actually confuse this really intense color for a really intense value. And rather than reaching for that pure cad red, for instance, they will instead put in a lot of titanium white because they're trying to show that the area feels really bright. But that's the thing about painting really glowing light. We don't want to mistake the intensity of that glow for something that's determined by value versus chroma, or the purity or intensity of a color. So in these body parts specifically, what's going to make a really significant difference is that you get very, very comfortable truly identifying what color it is on there that you need to match. And rather than going with what logically makes sense, which can be deceiving, and thinking to yourself as a result that you need to brighten up the value, what actually needs to happen is that you simply need a straightforward method to identify and then match the actual color. And sometimes it's helpful in this situation too, to give yourself a reminder that chances are that it's the chroma that's really intense versus the value being really intense. And this brings me to one additional secret, and that is creating a beautiful haze or glow around illuminated subjects. This is an area where we can fall into that exact same trap. We can see something plain as day in front of us, but our mind will play tricks on us and convince us that something else is responsible for that glowing effect, when actually it's really straightforward, and I'm gonna give you the formula for it right now. That being said, I need to kick off with a little bit of an explanation so this will make sense. So when an object is truly backlit, or maybe it is its own light source, as you can see in this example painting here, it doesn't have a hard edge against its background. there is this soft, glowing transition that happens. It's usually in those same warm colors that we talked about. So your cadmium oranges, your cadmium yellows, etc. And what painters tend to do wrong here, well, there's a couple things. First, the main mistake they will make is they will simply not acknowledge that there is a softening edge here. They'll say, okay, this object is really brightly lit and it's on a darker background. The contrast is really high, but it's only the foreground object itself that looks really bright. So I'm going to paint a really hard edge to this subject. One of the reasons why I love doing what I do in oil paints and using Alla Prima techniques specifically to paint something realistically, but doing it with this bent of abstraction where I really get to play with the brushwork, is that I can genuinely exaggerate and play with effects such as these. It's also what a lot of my favorite painters do. They really play with these glowing effects, and they look for ways that they can essentially start to merge their subject with the background. And there is no better place to look for this than when the subject is glowing, because our natural tendency will be to, again, just paint that really hard edge with really high contrast. But the reality is that that glow actually permeates upward beyond the object a little bit. And that's what happened in this particular painting. You can really see it off to the right-hand side of the figure here, and you can see it around her fingertips as well. I already talked about these like red intense pops of color in her fingers that are happening due to the subsurface scattering, but there's also this kind of white glow around her fingers, and this merges with this white glow that comes off of the right side of her face. This isn't happening because there's like a cloudy mist surrounding her. It's happening because the light is striking her at such an intensity that it essentially has this slight bloom effect that comes off of her. So often painters will nail every part of their color and their value when they're trying to create glowing light in a piece, but they'll miss just this one extra piece and it'll just make the whole painting feel like it comes apart, even though it's such a small detail, which is why I don't want you to miss this piece. Now, I want to put all of this together with some examples of artwork that I think really exemplify each of the secrets that I've been talking about in this video. So up first, I want to talk about hue shifting and then the glow effect. And I think both of these are really well exemplified in this painting of Victor from Arcane. So if any of you have watched this show, you will know that this character, he actually has hair that glows. And this is exemplified by his hair being like a blinding white. It's almost like you don't really know what color the hair is supposed to be because the hair itself is a light source. And so two really specific things happen. The first is that we absolutely get this bloom effect off the top of his head, where we don't get this really super hard edge between his hair and the background. And then the second thing that happens is that as the intensity of that light dies down a little bit, so right at the edge of his hair, where it's starting to softly blend into the background, we also get these hue shifts. So the hair essentially goes from a titanium white to titanium white plus a little bit of cad lemon, and then we start to get some cad yellow, and then we start to get some cad orange, and then we start to potentially show some darker colors before we get to the black of the background around him. If I hadn't captured both of these elements, the softened edge between the hair and the background and the hue shifting, it would not actually look like his hair was a light source. It wouldn't look like his hair is glowing. Instead, it would simply look like he has white hair. That being said, I know that it's not going to be often that we paint a subject who is meant to have glowing hair. So I'm going to use another painting example here. This is from my student, Catherine. She's heavily influenced by artists like Dan Gerhardt's. He is one of her North Star inspirations, and I absolutely love this piece that she created because not only has she captured this with beautiful brushwork and of course a great deal of care and accuracy in how the face was rendered, but it also just captures the color of the light so beautifully. And you'll notice if you look closely at this painting, you really don't see titanium white anywhere. You don't see any chalkiness anywhere in this piece either. She has really paid careful attention to the careful hue shifts that are happening in the lamp, the light source that she's carrying. It goes from cad red to cad orange to probably either cad lemon or cad yellow light. And we see these same things really echoed in the face. These same cadmium mixtures are really showing up in those skin tones. The only exception would be areas of the face that aren't getting touched by this warm light. And so we really balance the color of all of that warmth with these cooler shadows in this particular piece. But she's very careful to control her chroma and the hues of paint rather than the value to get this effect. It's not that her values are inaccurate, but she's not attempting to get this sense of glow by simply painting something lighter or darker. Instead, she's really making sure that her color mixtures are accurate throughout this entire piece. And the effect, it just really pays off. I really loved working with her to get her to the point where she could make these particular kinds of paintings because they're genuinely stunning. So, how do you actually get your confidence with color this strong so that you can capture light in a similar manner? Well, this is where the color exercises from that free PDF are really going to shine. But I'm going to walk you through my favorite one because these aren't just theoretical concepts. These are hands-on, studio-ready tools that will build your confidence with color, especially when you're aiming for that loose, painterly style. And I want to show you just what's possible. This first exercise is what I'm going to call your palette knife color checker. This comes directly from my own studio practice, and it came up recently when I was working on a John Singer Sargent master copy, and I hit a wall with my own color mixing. So here's how it works. First, when it comes to your reference material, you need a physical print of that reference that has accurate color. You don't want to be working from a screen. I cannot stress this enough. Screens are their own light source, and they will throw off your color perception of your own paint mixtures completely. So follow my lead here, and if your intention is to work from a photograph, get a cheap print from Walgreens or wherever. $5 is going to save you hours of frustration. Don't keep working off of your iPad screen or your computer screen if your goal is to get genuinely accurate color, at least not in the beginning. Next, you're going to mix up the color on your palette using your palette knife that corresponds with the area that you're wanting to paint and get that really accurate color. And you're going to hold up your paint mixture on your palette knife right over that corresponding area of the reference. So when the paint on your knife seems to just disappear into the reference, you know you've got the right color. Then, and this is crucial, trust that that color is correct and put it onto your painting, even if everything inside of you screams that that mixture has to be wrong. In the event that you mix up your color, you put it on your palette knife, you hold your palette knife up to the image, and it just doesn't quite look correct, well, you're just going to ask yourself these 3 questions. First, does it look incorrect because the color is too light or too dark? Adjust accordingly until it looks to be about the correct value. Next, you're going to ask, is it the right hue? So if it's not, you're going to ask, okay, does this need to be like a little bit more yellow or does it need to be a little bit more green? Essentially, you're just nudging that color in whatever direction it needs to go in order to look like it's ready to blend in with the target color that you're trying to capture from your reference. And then the third question is the color too intense, too chromatic, or is it too dull or desaturated? And you will simply adjust accordingly. If you can ask yourself these 3 questions, is it too light or too dark? Is the hue correct? And is it too chromatic or not chromatic enough? And you can adjust your paint accordingly. You should be able to duplicate just about any color you might encounter that you want to be able to match in your own work. This is critical when it comes to painting something like a glowing reference. If you have a reference you want to paint from where someone is being lit by candlelight or some other really intense, warm, glowing light source, so long as you have a good reference that captures that light, all you really need to do is put yourself through the paces of really mindfully making sure you are genuinely matching the color that you see. Oftentimes what happens, especially for Alla Prima oil painters, is that we want to do things quicker and more efficiently, and so we skip this really critical step. We wind up just mixing in a whole bunch of titanium white to get that feeling of lightness or glow, and then we're left with a really chalky mess. Now, this is simply my favorite, most straightforward exercise for this, but there are so many different ways that you can practice this skill. So make sure that you check out that PDF. It also has links to YouTube videos where I demo each of these exercises so that you can really see this in action and you're not kind of having to guess at exactly what this would look like in practice. I promise it's going to make a huge difference in your ability to paint those glowing light effects that we've been talking about. And look, painting light convincingly in oils, it isn't about having some inborn talent or expensive equipment or even specific training. It's about understanding these fundamental principles and then practicing them systematically. If you're ready to dive deeper into this, remember to grab that free color exercise guide that I mentioned in the beginning. It breaks down not just the exercise that I talked about today, but it gives you my full toolkit of exercises for color mastery that I give to my students every day. And I know it's going to help you in your painting practice. Once you grab that, here's what I want you to do after you watch this video. Pick one painting where the light isn't working the way you want to. And don't start a new painting. Work with something you've already got going and apply just one of these principles. Maybe it's those hue shifts in the areas where the light is really hitting your subject, or maybe it's softening some of those edges to create that glow effect. Try it, see what happens, and let me know in the comments how it goes. I want to hear what surprised you, what felt challenging. Your questions and your experiences in the studio really help me to know what to cover in future videos. Remember, every artist that you admire also went through this same learning process. The difference between where you are now and where you want to be isn't talent or potential. It is simply practice and taking the right approach. I can't wait to see what you create. And until next time, happy painting.